Ok, nous sommes de retour après une mini pause café. Merci d'être revenu à l'heure et merci pour les personnes en ligne de toujours être avec nous. Alors nous allons passer maintenant au deuxième panel de cette conférence dédiée aux politiques publiques et aux enjeux politiques de la gouvernance des villes de taille intermédiaire. Ce n'est pas pour dire que les politiques publiques ne sont pas politiques, parce que nous avons déjà abordé lors du premier panel certains enjeux politiques qui sont liés notamment à la définition des villes de taille intermédiaire. Mais nous allons nous intéresser dans ce deuxième panel à d'autres aspects, à d'autres enjeux politiques autour de cette croissance des villes intermédiaires qui peuvent être par exemple la reconnaissance d'une ville intermédiaire en tant que telle, en tant qu'entité administrative, la compétition des villes intermédiaires entre elles autour de l'obtention des financements qu'on a déjà abordé aussi au premier panel. Mais aussi la compétition entre villes intermédiaires et villes capitales qui reçoivent encore la plupart du PIB. Ensuite, on peut se poser la question de la représentation aussi au sein des villes intermédiaires. Il y a certains projets de villes nouvelles, par exemple, qui peuvent être classés de villes intermédiaires ou secondaires et qui n'ont pas encore de projet politique et de représentation politique claire. Donc tout cela est une série de questions que l'on peut se poser lorsqu'on parle du politique des villes intermédiaires. Nous avons un panel de 4 personnes qui vont nous faire, qui vont refléter justement des aspects très, très différents de ce politique des villes intermédiaires. Sans rentrer dans le détail de leur biographie, mais je vais brièvement vous les présenter. À ma gauche, il y a Lena Gutteil, une chercheuse du German Institute of Sustainability and Development basée à Bonn. Et elle s'intéresse notamment aux enjeux de la décentralisation de la société civile et leur participation au fonctionnement démocratique des villes intermédiaires. Et elle a fait de nombreux travaux, notamment sur le Kenya et l'Ouganda. Je suis particulièrement ravie aussi d'avoir un représentant politique, un représentant d'une ville intermédiaire, qui est Monsieur le maire Rufino d'Almeida, qui est maire de Boïcon au Bénin. Si vous voulez bien allumer votre caméra, comme ça on pourra aussi voir votre visage. Et qui va nous témoigner aussi des enjeux au quotidien en fait, de la représentation politique d'une ville intermédiaire. Nous avons dans notre panel en distanciel également Patience Muzuza, qui est chercheuse au Nordic Africa Institute à Uppsala. Ce qui est très intéressant dans ses travaux, c'est qu'elle fait la corrélation entre le secteur minier, l'évolution du secteur minier et le développement d'agglomérations urbaines autour de ces zones. Donc je pense que c'est aussi de cela qu'elle va témoigner aujourd'hui en s'intéressant notamment au cas de la Zambie. Et dernièrement, nous avons, et j'en suis très ravie, parmi nous, Karen Bucher, qui est professeure en recherche sur les conflits à l'université de Ghent en Belgique. Et ce qui est très, très intéressant et original dans ses recherches, c'est qu'elle relie la notion du politique de l'urbanisation aux enjeux des conflits et aux multiples aspects qui y sont liés, comme par exemple les déplacements, la présence militaire en ville, etc. Donc, hâte de vous entendre et je commence par une première présentation par Lena Gutteil.
Yeah, thanks so much, Zina. Thanks for having me and organizing this really great exchange. I'm happy to be here. And the first panel was actually a very good introduction, and I think provide a very good transition to what is to come. So what I want to focus on in this presentation is the politics of decentralization. So I think in order to understand how intermediary cities are governed, it's really crucial to take into account the institutional environment. That was raised already by Francois in the previous session. And yeah, I have this thing here. Right, so I think it doesn't go back, okay. Right. So cities' discretion in fiscal, administrative, and political matters is actually crucial to meet service delivery demands. And I think this depends very much on states' decentralization policies. So in this presentation, I really want to focus on this relationship between the central government and the local government, and highlight on a more broader basis how politicized these relationships are. And I do define decentralization in line with the African Union here as the transfer of power, responsibilities, capacities, and resources from national to all subnational levels of government. All right, so if we take a look at political decentralization in Africa, I think what is really interesting to note is that over the last 30 years or so, it has actually expanded significantly. I've present here the chart, the so-called local government index of the VDEM Institute, and it's composed of different entities. So this index comprises of, to what extent there are local governance bodies, how much discretion they have, and whether they're elected or appointed. And if you look at the chart, you will see that Sub-Saharan Africa is the light blue line. I hope you can see it. And you will see that it has actually, like the government discretion has actually expanded significantly. And up until to date, the level of decentralization is actually comparable to Asia. Interestingly, also to note that the purple line, which is Northern Africa, is at the bottom of the chart. So I think if we take the average between Northern Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, it will always be a little lower. But Northern Africa generally is much more centralized than Sub-Saharan Africa as of to date. I don't want to go too much into detail as to the reasons for the proliferation of decentralization. Just to mention that there were external and internal forces pushing for this. Externally, of course, we have the Structural Adjustment Program by the IMF and the World Bank, and also after the end of the Cold War, for instance, the good governance and democratization agenda of international donors that, of course, also contributed significantly to pushing for decentralization. But more interestingly, I think internally, also urbanization itself actually contributed to push for decentralization reforms, because with rising pressure on urban areas and central governments that couldn't provide for infrastructure and services anymore, I think that provided a really good rationale also for civil society, to demand actually for more powers at the local level. And we shouldn't forget all of the political reasons that I hope that we will cover more in the second panel. For central governments, of course, it comes in very handy, to fragment opposition at the local level, or to even augment presence of the central party at the local level by decentralization. So we should recognize that decentralization is definitely a nonlinear and very political process. So there are always episodes of centralization and decentralizations following one after the other. And so, yeah, we shouldn't think of it as a static status, but more as a dynamic process. So as of today, and this is also from the UCLG Institutional Environment Assessment, which I really recommend, 62% of all African countries rely on elected assemblies and executive bodies. So this goes to show that political decentralization is actually quite pronounced. There are only 19% of all countries that rely on appointed local assemblies and executives, and the remainder is more or less in between. And usually, and I think that's quite interesting, it is assumed that elected leaders are more accountable. So it's always presented as a really desirable state that we have elected local governments because they're more accountable, they can react better to citizens' preferences. But I have this example from Nigeria, and I'm happy that we have a colleague from Nigeria here who can maybe talk in the Q&A a little bit more about that. There's a piece of research that I found really interesting that showed that actually appointed councils performed better at the local level. So Nigeria has an interesting system in the sense that state governments can decide whether local councils are appointed or elected. And oftentimes, when state governors fear that their party wouldn't win the elections, they would simply call for appointed local councils. And this research that compared the performance of an appointed and elected council actually showed that in the eyes of the citizens, the appointed one performed better, mainly because citizens didn't expect much from it. Accountability was with the state government. And in case of the elected body, of course, officials had to, not only satisfy citizens' requirements, but also party godfathers' needs. And this led to a situation in which citizens expected much, but didn't actually get much in return. And I think this is quite interesting and goes to show that even though we always, advocate for elections in institutional context, where there is a lack of resources, lack of institutional capacity, this might not always be the preferred or the best option. The second example that I have here is Kenya, and I think probably many of you are aware of the massive decentralization reforms that Kenya had, starting with a new constitution that was introduced in 2010. And it's generally considered as quite a successful example of decentralization. So Kenya now has 47 counties, they have elected assemblies, they have elected governors, and the transfer of powers generally went really well. But what is really interesting to see here is that if we look at the level of the municipalities, decentralization was actually reversed, because before these reforms, local councils were elected, and nowadays they're appointed. And in effect, the first county elections, I think, took place in 2013. And ever since, counties have effectively taken over urban governance. And city boards, municipal boards have been created only in the past 5 years or so. And in this transfer of power to these city boards happens only very reluctantly. In my case, in the research that I've done earlier this year in Nakuru City in Kenya, I think it was very interesting to see that only in 2023, the city board got an official mandate and started to operate more efficiently, but also they have a lack of budget. And this really creates accountability challenges at the local level because it's such a small space. And in this setting, there are so many actors competing for visibility with the electorate. There is the member of county assembly, there is the city board, and then also the MP who is often involved. And this, at the end of the day, hampers coordination between actors, and effective governance altogether. Yeah, coming now to fiscal decentralization, I'm happy that this was raised before, and I think I don't even need to go that much into detail here anymore. Generally speaking, and I think that point got across also beforehand, is that fiscal decentralization is really lagging behind if we compare it to political decentralization. And that is at the root of many of the capacity issues that are happening, because local governments are chronically underfunded and transfers are not predictable. And I have here a chart showing the situation of subnational governments' revenue, depicted here as percentage of total government revenue, which just goes to show how big the gap is between Africa and the rest of the world. So Africa is here at 12% and Europe at 28%, and so on and so forth. And you could show the exact same chart with regard to local revenue, local expenditure, or even local investments. So we do have a situation in which African municipalities actually have the highest spending needs, but their public investments are in fact the lowest. And I really like that Margarita already said that there is nothing bad about transfers. Globally, municipalities do rely on transfers, but it is really that situation where the legal environment is often not sufficiently detailed so that transfers can be easily politicized. So this is like the first thing that central governments would do if cities are ruled by the opposition party. They would just can easily withhold transfers or delay them or withdraw competencies. And of course, also that lack of capacity to collect own source revenues that we've also touched upon a little bit goes to show that local governments are very much dependent on the benevolence of the central government. And I have the example of Kampala here. I know Kampala is not an intermediary city, but it's just a very nice example to illustrate these dynamics. Probably many of you are aware of the fact that in 2010, the elected Kampala City Council was replaced by an appointed body directly under the president. Very famous example. But I think what is more interesting is to see what happened beforehand. In 2005, Uganda introduced multi-party elections, and this was, I think, the root cause for President Museveni becoming really anxious about Kampala, because ever since it was leaning towards the opposition. And the very first thing that he did, actually, was to issue presidential decrees reducing the mandate or the capacities of local governments to raise taxes. And it was due to the fact that cities such as Kampala then had less revenues, that also service delivery quality deteriorated, which then gave him and the central regime basically a reason to centralize governance. Well, the story continues. I mean, with the new executive director of the city board, or whatever it is called, they were actually quite successful in raising own source revenue collection because they had the backing of the president. So that's also quite interesting to see how the central backing can actually lead to major reforms. But at the end of the day, this didn't mean that the president's party, the NRM, was more successful. Kampala is still leaning towards the opposition. Okay, by means of conclusion, I think the relationship between central and local actors has really significant impact on urban governance, and cities do compete for national resources. And despite the fact that many cities are actually responsible for creating most of the taxable wealth, they are not necessarily getting allocated a fair share of the resources that they contribute. And I think this is really a major issue. The difference between primary and intermediary cities remains a research caveat. I really hope that the other presentations can enlighten us a little more. The thing is that primary cities often have a special governance status, for instance, city counties, and I think that makes it already difficult to compare because the governance framework is entirely different. But I think one hypothesis that I would advance here and that we can discuss is that re-centralization attempts might be even more prevalent in primary cities because of their economic and political significance. And generally speaking, I think cities do have favorable conditions to implement decentralized governance. This is what also research from Asia showed, that decentralization actually worked out better in countries that were more urbanized. But at the same time, the degree of politicization, of course, in cities is higher. City governance is very much contested, and the strong presence of economic elites can also impede reforms at the local level. And I'll leave it here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lena, for this very insightful presentation and framing also of the discussion. I really liked how you put emphasis on the politics of decentralization and re-centralization, and also again to come back to the issue of how political finance is, especially the transfer of finance from central to the decentralized level. Maybe now Mr. Mayor, just noticing that I switched to English, Mr. Mayor Rufino d'Almeida, Mayor of Boicon, could give some testimony on how these issues of re-centralization and decentralization, especially also on the financial level, may affect your city. Thank you, and the floor is yours for 12 minutes. On ne vous entend pas pour le moment, monsieur le maire. Est-ce que vous pourriez allumer votre micro ou... Toujours pas. Si jamais il y a un souci technique qui doit être résolu de votre côté, on peut passer peut-être à un autre intervenant en attendant que le problème soit résolu. Ça marche pas, non ? Ok, donc ce qu'on va faire, si cela ne vous dérange pas, monsieur Almeida, peut-être vous pouvez donner un signe de tête. On va passer à une autre intervenante en attendant que la connexion ou le problème de micro soit résolu de votre côté. Dans ce cas, je vais donner la parole à Patience Mozouza, si elle est toujours avec nous, pour nous parler de la corrélation entre développement urbain et secteur minier en Zambie.
All right. Thank you, Sina, for the invitation to this conference, and I've listened with great interest. Actually, the discussion around secondary cities and Africa's urbanization. I'm a senior researcher at the Nordic Africa Institute, working at the intersection of mining and urbanization, with a focus on mining towns. And so, in this presentation, I will effectively set the context through which some of this, the thinking around the kind of urban questions, but also how one might think about, in particular, kind of growth that is happening around mining and urbanization. So I will share my screen shortly. Just yes. So increasingly, the big concern across the continent, given the urbanization dynamics, is in what ways Africans are making and managing their cities, and what kinds of political agency do these processes of self-provisioning produce, from the creation of water, housing, and being able to kind of provide educational services that where the state is minimally absent. So what kind of political agency is it producing? And what kinds of organizational structures are residents drawing on? And which are the ones that are being created in the process? We tackle some of these questions in an edited collection that's out with my good colleague, Stephen Ma, who's based at the University of Malmö in southern Sweden. And I use this effectively as a kind of scaffolding to speak to, the kind of broad concerns. So we know that roughly more than half of Africans' residents live in informal settlements, and that does not include, the majority of residents are having to provision their own infrastructure and services. And that does not also include what is happening at the intersection between the kind of rural and the urban. Thus, much of the continent's city infrastructure, including housing, roads, drains, and services such as water, are created and run by residents via interactions with public authorities, be they closer or far, and private actors. And all this occurs within a context within which decades of varying kind of neoliberal policies have reconfigured the role of the state. And for many of the continent's countries, this reconfiguration has entailed a shifting away from the role of the developmental state that was quite prevalent in the 60s to 70s, where the state was tasked with meeting the infrastructural and services needs of populations emerging from repressive colonial rule. But as Lena mentioned earlier, kind of economic crisis and decline and instituted structural adjustment policies effectively saw countries becoming saddled with a big debt, increasingly diminishing their role in the provision of public services. And so now, since that period, countries have turned their attention, many African countries have turned their attention to how they can attract private sector investment into their economies, including infrastructure. However, it's been quite a bit of a struggle to attract investment for infrastructure projects oriented towards public services such as water and sanitation. And in my work, in particular on the Zambian Copper Belt, this becomes really apparent because the kind of scale of large inequalities within the society means that public utilities, even when they do exist, effectively struggle to collect the revenue from residents and effectively hinders the capacity to expand. And where these investments have occurred, at least in the context that I work in, it has been largely related to large-scale extractive industries such as mining, where housing, physical infrastructure, and services that have been required to attract high-skilled labor, often to remote settings, have effectively catalyzed the creation of a kind of what I'd call the kind of mining town locality, which then becomes the potential scaffolding for kind of wider service provision, though this even then is quite patchy. So the state's role increasingly has become more or less, argue, a facilitator of capital investment and increasingly a partner to it through public-private partnerships. And for the state to attract capital, it then must strive for good governance, rule of law, which effectively has entailed robust mechanisms to protect property rights. But as many of you working in African cities know, this is a big challenge because effectively ineffectual bureaucracies for land administration, multiple nodes of land governance, including customary tenure, and a range of others, effectively, where you also have kind of like, forest reserves and protected lands, effectively means that residents who struggle to access state leasehold land in the context of Zambia or struggle to raise the finances to buy freehold land effectively appropriate or squat on land and effectively organize their housing there. And in the meanwhile, long-term fiscal discipline has effectively meant little social spending on services, despite actually increasingly some governments deciding a much more developmental role. And so what this has done is that it has effectively expanded the private sphere in service provision, not just kind of families and residents kind of organizing their own services, but effectively kind of a range of micro to macro scale investments in housing and infrastructure. At the lower end, kind of very, very small infrastructures around, hand-dug wells, pit latrines, and trying to set up energy infrastructure where people can afford kind of limited services, solar panels. But in kind of a broader, for people who have much more access to money, it has led actually to the growth of gated estates, even within these kind of like smaller towns that are emerging around extractive locales. And so what this has created in quite political terms has effectively is a tension where the state effectively attempts to kind of manage its urban, its role and adopts a kind of managerial role in the management of land and infrastructure in an attempt to attract kind of good governance. But at the same time, it blurs the line of where the responsibilities and the state lie in relation to one another. And so to kind of, just to kind of quickly sum up in terms of what that kind of implies in quite practical terms, with potentially also quite of quite limited geopolitical implications, is that if you look, for example, and this is kind of work emerging from research connected to a research project, Changing Urban Residents, of which actually Karen, sitting on the panel there, is a part of, working on DR Congo, and I'm working on the Zambia side, and the project lead, Christina, has been looking at kind of growth around kind of mining boom towns, displacement caps and others in Angola. But what you have, for example, up on the screen is effectively the scale of, an average annual population growth rates within the mining regions. So you have the Zambian Copperbelt province, which is kind of the old mining areas with slowed growth as a result of kind of long-term protracted austerity. The key growth is happening around what they describe as the new Copperbelt in Northwestern province, in particular around Solwezi district and Kalumbila district, where you have the large-scale mines by First Quantum Minerals and others, effectively kind of key copper producers. There you see the emergence of 2 small mining towns with 4 workers, infrastructure and services developed in those areas, but operating in a kind of enclaving dynamics, i.e. kind of, creating this kind of fragmented landscape. All around, these developments emerged in an area where effectively, which was largely governed by on customary tenure. And so multiple localities have emerged around this area that are effectively consolidating into some kind of, rural urban conglomeration. Some, the ones closer to the mining towns with access to services such as electricity, the ones a little bit further away, not having those particular services, limited spending despite the kind of, growth rates of 8%, barely any kind of educational infrastructure and services, despite the sheer amount of capital and economic activities that have emerged around there in terms of agricultural activities, mobile financial services centered around mobile money services, because not even banking services have arrived there. Limited trunk infrastructure for water and sanitation, which is really not an issue at the moment, not too much of a crisis at the moment, because the area has not densified per se, even though it's developing a quite strongly urban character. So the challenges that you see in primary cities such as Lusaka of great densification with limited water services and sewer facilities, kind of creating a public health hazard, are barely there. And so it is within this context of large-scale mining developments and kind of infrastructure where one can also kind of locate, I would say, the kind of attractiveness of, for example, of proposals around infrastructure developments that might emerge around the kind of EU Global Partnership, Gateways, and China Belt and Roads Initiative. It's kind of intersect, because what this kind of trunk infrastructure around kind of large-scale mining do is that they provide, to some extent, these kind of key infrastructure nodes that are fragmented for the context, but still nevertheless provide growth and economic activities around them. But it also kind of raises key questions around the kind of political governance and administration of these areas, because municipal governments, for example, in the district of Kalumbila, only emerged around 2018. And they're effectively establishing themselves way after the development of kind of 2 large-scale mines. And so chiefs, private businessmen, agricultural cooperatives effectively provide some level of governance and effectively leading to what a hybrid multi-node governance system that in the long term may have political implications in terms of how these varying organizational structures relate to the emergent state infrastructures with these decentralization plans that are being put in place.
Thank you so much, Patience. Merci beaucoup. Pour une question de cohérence thématique, je pense que ce que je propose de faire, c'est de me tourner maintenant vers Karen Bucher pour sa présentation et cohérence régionale également. Et puis, on va donner à la fin la parole à Monsieur le maire qui pourra conclure la session.
Merci beaucoup. Ok. Oui, je vais aussi présenter mon travail en anglais, comme je travaille toujours en anglais, c'est plus facile. Mais je peux répondre aux questions en français. So I'm going to elaborate further on the political characteristics or the political stakes of urbanization from a particular perspective of violent conflict. So I'm a conflict scholar. I research dynamics of war and more specifically in Eastern DRC. And so I've always been very interested in this relationship or intersection between war and urbanization. So today I will specifically focus on small town urbanization, and it's to some extent related to Patient's presentation. We also have worked together on mining urbanization issues. So just very briefly to contextualize Eastern DRC. So we have a context, the Kivu regions, North and South Kivu in particular, they experience protracted violent conflicts for a long time now. So we're talking about generations of civil war, which of course had a huge transformative impact on societies. So also we have a context of a very fragmented state. So when we talk about role of the state, it's indeed very fragmented. Also a very important role of armed groups in this region that are also very applied in governance and rule. So what we see in this region is that urbanization or rural-urban transformation is clearly related to dynamics of war. So urbanization is one of the outcomes of this very profound transformation of society. So through this civil war, people became increasingly mobile and societies also became increasingly urban. And this has to do with a very complex set of push and pull factors, which I'm not going to go into that deep. I will just cross over some. So you have this phenomenon of boomtown urbanization emerging from wartime mobility. So you have in this context of war, you have different forms of urbanization. So you have, on the one hand, the spectacular growth of provincial cities, so existing cities like Goma and Bukavu, which are large cities that have, colonial past and so on, so large established cities. And so people move in search for protection, for stability, but also just like for education, for jobs. And so on the one hand, you see this very fast expansion because of people massively migrate to these existing cities. But you also see another phenomenon, which is the emergence of new cities in places that were formerly really rural places. So, and they grow around different dynamics. So these emerging boomtowns are driven by different dynamics. The first one is mining. In this area, it's more specifically artisanal mining, or not, the relation between mining and war in this place of the world. So it's very political, it's very much connected to the dynamics of civil war, but it's a very important livelihood for people, especially for mobile people who have to leave their agricultural livelihoods. So you get concentrations of people around mines. People tend to stay. You have large demographic concentrations that in the end also attracts all other actors to those places. Another very important dynamic is the concentration of IDPs, internally displaced people. So people are mobile, they have to flee, and they will flock around places where there is already some established, infrastructure, the presence of security forces. And so those two dynamics, mining and IDP concentration, are often very much in intersection or connected in this boomtown urbanization process. We're talking about small towns. I think some of the cases that I refer to even have less than 30,000 or 15 or 20,000. So it's very small agglomerations. And they have, as you can imagine, so they emerge beyond any form of formal urban planning. So they're really spontaneous settlements. As I said, so there is an increased demographic presence because of all kinds of, especially push factors to particular places. But when you have this concentration, people have needs, right? So there is commerçants and other investors and actors that follow those people. And so these places then further develop into very dynamic economic places. Interesting also is that they attract people from the surroundings. So different from the rural surroundings, those are places that are ethnically diverse. It's important because, yeah, urbanization, civil war, ethnicity plays a very important role in governance, in the politics of place and representation, and so on. So you have diverse demographies in terms of ethnicity, diverse economic activities, and so on. Those are the typical places, even from the spatial characteristics. If you visit them, you can't really call them fully urban. Several of them are still very urban or rural in their infrastructure. So it's really something in between. Very important, if you talk about the characteristics, is that those are very militarized contexts. So concentration of people also means concentration of security actors, whether they're state actors or non-state actors. You have a tension there because these places in war, they symbolize places of protection, right? People go to these places to seek protection, security, and safety. But what is happening in this development of these boom towns is that their growth and their very contested governance also creates new fault lines and sources of conflictualities. Also important, I think, is this idea, we mentioned it in the first panel, of temporalities, right? So you have a process of urbanization that we call boom town. So you have a very fast growth, but boom can also stop at some point and even result in bust. Of course, we talk about places that are heavily dependent on, for instance, artisanal mining, which depends very much on global financial flows and prices. So some of these towns can also very fastly disappear again. So I think it's important, if you talk about investments, development, temporalities, that this is also a reality. So very briefly, so you have on the one hand cases of boom towns that emerge around artisanal mining activities. We have some examples here, Numbi, Nyabibe, Rubaya. And their growth is, so their boom or their growth is very much related to the boom, the global boom in the demand for coltan and cassiterite natural resources. Very much, so their growth was also very much connected to dynamics of the RCD rebellion. So yeah, they're very much, their growth and their emergence is very much connected to also that war, and these places played important roles in mobilization, armed mobilization of this rebel group. So that translates, for instance, in the way how local governance is composed, that you can see that what we call big men in these places that hold a lot of power still have histories in these rebel movements. As I said, so you have mining activities followed by also IDPs, influx and traders, and you get the proliferation of economic activities. Then you have centers that emerge around the concentration of IDPs. So this case, for instance, of Kichanga is a case where you had at some point IDP camps, so with some minimal camp infrastructure that was governed by different actors, amongst them also UNHCR. But then the camp urbanized. So you have many cases of that where people seek security. They just come together in some improvised IDP camp, but then they stay. And the process of this becoming permanent is very political. I will say a bit more on that later. So some of them have also large histories. I said the war is going on for a long time, so we have different phases of the settlement of IDPs. So you have urbanization that is the outcome of the becoming permanent of places that are actually, an IDP camp is something that is explicitly temporary normally, right? So you have an urbanization that is built on temporariness becoming permanent. Of course, this urbanization is very much conflictual because it is very much connected to contested claims to land. And this contestation in this part of the DRC is very strongly informed by the whole idea of autochthony, like who owns this place, which ethnic group can actually claim the land. So you can imagine when there is an influx of people from different ethnicities, how that creates competition that translates into ethnic cleavages. So you have a different layered meaning of the, because those places are often called cities of refuge, zones of refuge, where people seek refuge, but they also become strongholds for armed groups, because you have to imagine places where there is a concentration of IDPs often represent places with a high potential for mobilization. So armed groups also tend to mobilize in those places, tend to install themselves in these places. So that's also something explicitly political. Now talking about governance, so how these places are governed, who has power, who has public authority. So of course, those are very complex political arenas with very explicit competition for power, authority, and control between a variety of actors. So you have big men, we're talking about places that are economically very important around mines. So we have these big men that have an interesting authority built on the one hand on military sources, on economic sources and political sources. You also have a very strong power for customary authorities, right? So those are boom towns, but they're really situated within rural hinterland. So the customary, the traditional chiefs, they hold very large, scales of power, and they also, of course, represent ethnic claims to land and power. And then you have all kinds of armed groups. So there also is a very strong military component of governance. So this variety of local actors are very strongly entangled with broader political geographies of war. And that's very important, because sometimes even if you visit those places, they seem so isolated, completely far away, disconnected, right? Like sometimes it's very hard even to access them because there are no roads and so on. So they seem completely isolated, but actually they're very, very strongly connected to national struggles, national political geographies. Of politics and war. And so so these governance actors, they locally try to legitimize their power through the provision of services. So these big men, they can mobilize money to build roads because the state is not there. So because they provide this infrastructure, they become also respected and have some legitimacy. The urbanization in those places is explicitly politicized. So it also really speaks to the presentation of Lina. It's explicitly politicized in many ways. So we talk about secondary cities, they're quite small, but they have a really important primary political importance today in the political landscape. So it's peripheral urbanization, but with truly central political stakes. And I think that's really important. So these truly peripheral urbanism represent a central political arena from which you can study broader struggles of power and public authority in this region. And then decentralization. So that's the last part of my presentation. Because these politics of urbanization become very explicit and are truly magnified through the process of the decentralization policy in the DRC. So as you know or not, the decentralization policy was very strongly internationally supported because it was believed that it would contribute to peace, stability, and good governance. So the decentralization agenda was very much promoted by the external donor community in this intertwinement with peace building initiatives. So decentralization is important to understand the formalization and politicization of this boomtown urbanization. So very shortly and practically, so within the decentralization agenda, there had to be made new lists of cities. And so they had to identify which centers can now, because they boomed so fast, can now be considered as communes. So it's a different administrative definition with huge political implications. So if a village becomes a commune, it means a completely different governance of local resources, completely different systems of political representation, elections, and so on. So the stakes are very high. So it's not just an administrative shift, it's truly political. And so you could see huge tensions and mobilizations going on around whether or not these towns would be then recognized as cities or communes. And in this part of the DRC, this level of decentralization went really wrong in some places. So it really incited additional tensions and conflicts because it was so much interwoven with political, military, and ethnic mobilization. So one example is Minembwe. It's quite of an extreme case. So it's a small boom town which was recognized as a commune, very contested, and actually the minister of decentralization is from that place. So it's a very explicit story of politicization. So the Minister of Decentralization decided that this place would become a commune. He has a history in rebellion. This place used to be an important stronghold. And so there was a huge contestation, especially from the customary authorities, because if the place would become a commune, the customary authorities would be completely ousted. They would lose all their authority. So they tried to mobilize to different scales, provincial, national, to block this decentralization process. But because it's such a fragile place, there was also the mobilization of armed groups. So it resulted in violent clashes, many casualties, villages, a huge forced displacement. And in the end, it became a national crisis where the president himself had to pronounce and suspend the entire process. The bottom picture is a picture of Congolese manifesting or protesting Minembwe becoming a commune in the diaspora. So it became really a thing where even, globally in London or Paris, Congolese diaspora were also really fighting to block that political decision. So to conclude some highlights. So what we see is these emerging urbanities in the Kivu provinces are the outcome of very unstable, uncertain political processes. So we talk about, new cities that are there. Of course, they have huge potential, but we have to understand where they come from and how, fragile they are in this particular context of war. And so on the one hand, these towns are a clear product of violent conflict, but they also can be new producers of additional layers of violent conflict. I already said that the urbanization is strongly intertwined with agendas of political, military, and ethnic mobilization. And so the political stakes at the margins, and we're talking here about peripheral urbanization, so the margins of formal state authority really shows the challenges of this highly politicized urbanization. And so we just published a paper together with Stephanie. I'm very happy she's here. The paper will come out soon, which is about the decentralization agenda. And so we were, the very problematic effects it had in Eastern DRC. And so one of the things that came out was that, when we had to talk to policymakers, is that these international and local policymakers pushing for decentralization as a means to achieve increasing political and economic autonomy need to be aware of these very problematic opposite effects and have to, really take these politics serious. So we would really ask for a very critical assessment of the destabilizing and conflict-inducive effects of decentralization reforms in these settings of war, because the stakes are so high. It entails a very highly sensitive issue with extremely high potential for conflict. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Karen, for this very insightful presentation with lots of information also, I think, from the ground, lots of empirical insights on the correlation between urban development, the politics of urban development in conflict-affected area. So I think we have more opportunity to discuss these issues in the Q&A. I try not to take too long because we are already running out of time. I'm now finally turning to Rufino d'Almeida, mayor of Boicon. Monsieur le maire, vous avez la parole pendant une douzaine de minutes et merci d'avoir patienté. Monsieur d'Almeida, est-ce que vous nous entendez? La connexion a l'air très instable. Si vous voulez, vous pouvez couper peut-être votre vidéo et on entendra vos paroles.
Bon.
Monsieur le maire, vous nous entendez?
Vous m'entendez? Oui, moi, je vous entends très bien. Moi, je vous entends très bien.
On vous entend mal, je vous invite à peut-être couper votre vidéo, comme ça ça sera peut-être un peu plus simple.
Très bien. C'est le retour que vous m'entendez. Attendez, est-ce que vous m'entendez?
On vous entend.
Oui, est-ce que vous m'entendez?
Oui.
Ça change à quoi? Est-ce que vous m'entendez? C'est bon, vous m'entendez?
Oui.
Donc, je peux y aller.
Oui, vous pouvez aller.
Merci beaucoup. Merci à vous et désolé pour tous ces désagréments. Voilà, je voudrais d'entrée de jeu remercier l'IFRI et l'AFD pour cette tribune d'échange. Je suis le maire de la commune de Boicon depuis 3 ans et demi. Et Boicon est une ville du Bénin qui est au centre du Bénin. C'est une ville qui a été créée dans ses périmètres actuels depuis les années 70. Elle comporte 10 arrondissements. La population de Boicon est d'aujourd'hui de 233 000 habitants. 233 000 habitants. Et aujourd'hui, c'est la 7e ou 8e ville la plus peuplée du Bénin sur les 77. La population de Boicon est passée de 1991 à ce jour de 81 000 habitants à 230 000 habitants, soit un triplement de la population en 10 ans. Vous avez bien entendu, un triplement de la population en 10 ans. C'est la 5e ville économique du Bénin et c'est la principale ville carrefour du Bénin. Pour que vous fixiez les idées, Boicon est à 1 heure de la frontière nigériane, en passant par Kobe, et à 1 heure de la frontière togolaise, en passant par Adidja, et à 2 heures de Cotonou, la ville la plus connue, et à 1h30 de Calabi, la ville la plus peuplée du Bénin. Et Boicon fait également frontière avec Abomey, qui est la grande ville historique, la ville des Amazones. Les activités à Boicon, c'est essentiellement le transport, l'hôtellerie et le commerce. Même si Boicon est la ville la plus industrialisée des départements centraux du Bénin. Le taux d'accroissement en matière de population de Boicon est de 4% environ. La classification des villes au Bénin, c'est 3 catégories. Il y a 4 villes qui sont des villes à statut ordinaire, donc les plus grosses, Cotonou, Porto Novo, Parakou et Abomey-Calavi. Et puis les villes à statut intermédiaire, qui sont au nombre de 19. Boycon est une ville à statut intermédiaire depuis 2 ans environ. Et, et que dire? Le fait que la population de Boycon ait été multipliée par 3 en 10 ans pose véritablement certains enjeux. Les enjeux de gestion du territoire, puisque la population a augmenté 3 fois en 10 ans, mais pour autant, le territoire n'a pas augmenté. Donc, ceci pose des problèmes de gestion des espaces, en tout cas de leur occupation, ainsi que de sécurisation des personnes. Alors, des initiatives ont été prises ces 3 dernières années par la municipalité, par la commune. Il s'agit d'abord de l'élaboration de plusieurs documents d'urbanisme. Et nous avons élaboré le schéma directeur d'aménagement urbain, le SDO, qui permet une planification plus aisée du territoire communal. Nous avons également élaboré le plan directeur d'urbanisme qui comporte les règles d'urbanisation. Enfin, nous avons élaboré le plan de contingence communale qui prend en compte, qui définit les mesures pour éviter les catastrophes naturelles et ou si elles arrivaient, pour y faire face efficacement. Ensuite, l'autre enjeu de Boycon, il s'agit, l'atout principal de Boycon, vous l'avez compris, il s'agit de son positionnement géographique, ce qui fait d'elle une ville carrefour. C'est une ville qui dispose d'au moins 6 gares routières, et parmi les plus importantes du pays, ainsi qu'une gare ferroviaire, même si aujourd'hui, ça ne fonctionne pas. Il est à noter, et c'est important, que les réformes engagées par l'État central, qui se traduisent par la construction tout azimut de routes dans tout le pays, rend de moins en moins ville carrefour Boycon. Avant le Boycon, quand on coupait Boycon, on coupait le Bénin en deux. Aujourd'hui, ce n'est plus le cas. En tout cas, depuis 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 ans, ce n'est plus le cas, puisque des routes ont été construites un peu partout qui permettent de contourner aujourd'hui Boycon, puisqu'il y a d'autres axes. Aussi, pour sauvegarder, pour pérenniser Boycon et garder le statut de ville, de petite agglomération structurante de Boycon, nous avons engagé comment on va dire, le repositionnement de Boycon sur l'axe culturel. C'est ainsi que j'ai proposé au conseil communal de repositionner la ville de Boycon sur l'axe culturel par la mise en valeur de l'énorme potentiel culturel, artistique et touristique de Boycon qui sommeillait. Et depuis 3 ans, Boycon est en train d'être repositionné afin de conserver sa population, afin depuis parmi les villes créatives UNESCO d'Afrique. Et la première en Afrique dans la catégorie restauration. Et la deuxième au Bénin, toutes catégories confondues. Et ceci est également traduit par l'instauration d'une foire internationale, une biennale à Boycon. De la même façon que nous avons instauré à Boycon les journées du consommation local pour la valorisation des produits et services du terroir. Nous avons également commencé la réhabilitation des palais royaux. Et vous aurez compris que nous sommes en train de préparer Boycon pour que Boycon devienne une ville touristique. Et en cela, nous arrivons le tourisme dans les prochaines années. Donc, Boycon est en train de se préparer pour être une des grandes villes touristiques du pays. Nous avons également mis en place un fonds communal d'appui aux arts, à la culture et au tourisme. Nous sommes en train de travailler pour la création dans les prochaines années d'un musée d'art moderne. Et en cela, nous avons sollicité l'accompagnement de l'Association internationale des maires francophones, ainsi que d'autres bailleurs. Nous allons également créer, sous fonds communal, l'Office du tourisme, ainsi qu'un restaurant-école qui va former les populations pour la conservation du savoir ancestral en matière culinaire. Donc, c'est un restaurant qui a vocation à valoriser les mets locaux pour leur pérennisation. Nous avons également créé un festival des arts d'ici et d'ailleurs. Tout ceci pour pouvoir amener du monde à Boycon. Car je vous ai dit, Boycon est la deuxième place hôtelière du Bénin et avec plus de 100 hôtels. Et nous entendons garder le niveau de fréquentation de nos hôtels. C'est pour cela que nous sommes obligés de créer toutes ces manifestations afin de capter que le week-end, la population de Boycon augmente de 10-20 de Boycon en quelques années et nous amène puis des infrastructures. Nous sommes une grande ville à l'échelle du Bénin, mais à l'échelle du monde, nous ne sommes pas une grande ville. Alors, ceci nous amène à tout faire pour capter les fonds d'aide aux communes alloués par l'État. La cagnotte n'est pas extensible. Alors, ces fonds sont alloués aux villes en fonction de leur population, en fonction de leurs besoins, mais également en fonction des performances que ces villes accomplissent et du point de vue de la gouvernance locale. Et en la matière, Boycon a fait un grand bond. Nous étions, il y a cela 3 ans, nous étions au dernier classement de l'indice de gouvernance locale. Nous étions 68e sur 77. Au dernier classement, nous sommes 8e. Et c'est la ville qui a fait le plus grand bond en matière de gouvernance locale. Alors, nous en attendons beaucoup de subsides puisque ce critère va nous permettre de recevoir plusieurs dizaines de milliers de francs CFA en guise d'accompagnement de l'État central. Et toujours dans l'optique de conserver notre niveau de mobilisation de ressources, nous avons mis en place un dispositif pour candidater systématiquement aux appels à candidature, appels à projet à l'international. C'est ainsi qu'il y a 2 ans, nous avons été le lauréat d'un appel à projet lancé par l'Organisation internationale de la francophonie. Nous avons également été la seule commune du Bénin à avoir reçu le double bonus ACS de la Banque mondiale. C'est un bonus qui récompense les communes qui ont pu exécuter les projets dans les délais et dans les règles de l'art. Nous avons été la seule commune du Bénin à avoir été récompensée 2 fois. Et 22 millions de fois, ça nous fait 44 millions de francs CFA pour avoir réalisé les projets dans le temps et dans l'espace, dans les délais. Nous avons également, nous menons également une diplomatie communale, ce qui nous a valu le soutien de plusieurs ambassades. Le dernier en date, c'est la semaine dernière seulement, où l'ambassade de Chine a accepté d'accompagner la ville de Boycon dans l'éclairage du marché international de Boycon. Je dois vous avouer que Boycon est en coopération avec plusieurs villes du monde, notamment les villes belges, la ville belge de Zorcel et celle de Neupré, qui nous accompagne également dans nos projets. Tout ceci pour vous dire que le fait que Boycon soit une commune intermédiaire, mais c'est la commune qui est en passe d'entrer dans la catégorie des communes à statut particulier, nous amène à œuvrer pour garder le niveau économique de notre pays, son attractivité également. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le maire, Monsieur Almeida. Nous avons écouté 4 présentations très riches qui ont fait le lien entre décentralisation, transfert et captation de ressources pour le développement des villes, émergence de villes nouvelles. Ça aussi, c'était un terme, une autre forme de ville nouvelle que celle dont on parle généralement. Je vous invite, pour ne pas monopoliser la parole et étant donné le temps qui passe vite, je vous invite à la fois pour les personnes en ligne de mettre vos questions dans le chat et peut-être dans un premier temps pour les personnes en salle de poser vos questions si vous en avez. Est-ce qu'il y a une première question? Sinon...
Allez, je vais me lancer. Merci pour les présentations effectivement très riches. Peut-être pour faire le lien entre recherche et pratique, il y avait toute cette question de la décentralisation, recentralisation et le lien entre les villes intermédiaires et le gouvernement locaux. Et du coup, je voulais peut-être profiter de la présence de Monsieur le maire pour faire le lien entre ce qui avait été dit par les chercheurs auparavant et lui, son vécu. Au-delà d'une stratégie bien établie de développement de la ville, quel vécu en fait de ces relations avec le niveau national?
Oui, vous m'entendez cette fois-ci? C'est bon?
Oui, on vous entend.
Parfait. Vous savez, le niveau national, malheureusement ou heureusement, c'est le niveau national qui édicte les lois. Actuellement, au Bénin, nous sommes en train d'expérimenter une
Monsieur le maire, excusez-moi.
loi
Monsieur le maire. Oui.
Février 2022, sachant que la précédente date, oui,
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 est-ce que vous pouvez reprendre, s'il vous plaît,
oui,
parce que
depuis la
votre
vidéo.
connexion est vraiment très faible. Est-ce que vous pouvez juste reprendre votre réponse parce qu'on vous a très mal entendu? Désolée.
Oui, bien sûr. Je disais simplement que actuellement au Bénin, nous sommes en train d'expérimenter depuis une année et demie environ une nouvelle décentralisation, en tout cas une nouvelle loi sur la décentralisation. La décentralisation au Bénin a commencé depuis les années 2000, mais l'année dernière, le gouvernement a fait édicter par le Parlement une nouvelle loi dont nous sommes en train de l'éprouver. Et je peux vous dire que ce n'est pas simple tous les jours. Cette loi vise à découpler les fonctions politiques des fonctions administratives. Et cette loi est venue en quelque sorte, on va dire, chambouler un peu les habitudes que nous avions. Aujourd'hui, nous sommes en train d'expérimenter cette nouvelle loi avec des réussites, mais également quelques bégaiements. Il est question que nous fassions le point d'ici 2 ans, donc au mois de février prochain, pour voir quelles sont les améliorations à apporter à cette loi. Les relations avec l'État central, c'est essentiellement le contrôle. Je peux vous dire que ces 30 derniers jours, j'ai reçu pas moins de 3 audits. L'audit mené par la cellule présidentielle de suivi de la réforme, l'audit mené par la structure qui gère les marchés publics et l'audit mené par le gouvernement, par le ministère de tutelle, le ministère de la décentralisation qui vise à voir l'utilisation que nous avons fait des fonds mis à notre disposition, des fonds d'aide aux communes. Vous voyez, donc c'est à peu près cette relation ou ces relations-là qui me lient à l'État central.
Merci beaucoup. Je vois 2 autres questions. Donc peut-être d'abord Mansouro, puis Jean-Fabien.
Thank you very much. I want to appreciate the presenters. I have a comment and a question. My comment goes to Lenia Gutel. Yes, I'm fascinated with your presentation on decentralization. You mentioned that appointed councils performed better. So far, I'm a Nigerian, and the feeling back at home, and with what I know is that when it comes to decentralization, the elected council chairmen, they perform better than the appointed ones. I'll give you the reasons. Because we have found out from experience that those who are elected in the past, they seem to have this connection with the grassroots people, especially in their electoral campaign. And as a result of that, most often they are very, very loyal to fulfilling their electioneering promises. But in the case of the appointed ones, because they don't have any mandate given to them by anybody, there is this administrative recklessness. We've had cases of unaccountability. They are not accountable to the people don't know them. And so, a survey, ordinarily, I don't know the source of your data, I don't know the extent or whatsoever, but the general, if you do a survey or a collation from, random sampling or whatsoever of local government, you get feedback from people that those appointed, they tilt towards doing things arbitrarily, without accountability, without performance. But the elected ones, because they will always be need to seek for re-election, they tend to perform better. So that's my comment on that. You need to do more, And then my question goes to the man who spoke on Boycom, the Boycom mayor, yes, Rufino de Almeida, the Boycom mayor. Yes, in your presentation, you mentioned something very, very interesting, that yes, Boycom has been a UNESCO creative city in Africa, and as a result of that, you are also trying to prepare Boycom to become a tourist city. Yes, it's very good. We all know that tourism itself has a lot, to put in place. And one of those things to put in place is the security issue. We have security problems, then tourism will not flourish. And then you mentioned that there are security issues, except that you have not told us the kind of security issues. So I put a question to you now that in your preparation, what is the level of preparation concerning, what has been put in place to address the security issues that you identified in your presentation in preparing Boycom to become a tourist city? Thank you very much.
Jean-Rabien?
Yes, thank you. A very short question.
OK.
We spoke about...
Très bien, je peux y aller?
Je vais récolter encore 2 questions et après on vous donne la parole.
OK.
Okay, thank you, Sina. Yes, we spoke about the relation between cities and the state, and we spoke about centralization, decentralization, re-centralization. But what about the urban inhabitant, and what about the urban citizen? We spoke a little bit of them. We show some demonstration about Minembwe, even in London, as you mentioned. But how can we analyze the room left for inhabitants in governance process that you described in your various case? Thank you.
Julien, and then we will...
Et en fait, ça rejoint à peu près le même point que Jean-Fabien, et c'est une question notamment pour Karen sur... je trouvais effectivement intéressant les photos qu'on a vues à la fin de votre présentation, et parce que ma question était quelle est la position des populations, en effet, qu'elles soient déplacées ou autochtones, vis-à-vis de ces multiples échelons de gouvernance ou toute cette économie politique avec différents acteurs? Est-ce qu'il y a des tentatives d'élection ou de tentatives de manifestation pour une représentation plus légitime des populations elles-mêmes, d'une part? Et l'autre question, c'est quel est, de votre point de vue, le niveau de sentiment d'appartenance de ce territoire-là à l'État congolais? On voyait aussi sur les photos la revendication d'être en territoire congolais et pas forcément en territoire rwandais, si j'ai bien compris l'allusion qu'il y avait sur l'une des photos. Mais effectivement, dans un contexte où, si je comprends bien, l'État est très difficilement pourvoyeur de services publics ou très peu présent pour les populations, sa légitimité est forcément contestée. Voilà. Est-ce qu'il y a des revendications par ailleurs d'autonomie, par exemple, plus fortes de ces territoires vis-à-vis d'un État par rapport à un autre pour finalement s'auto-administrer tranquillement, entre guillemets? Voilà, j'aimerais avoir un peu plus d'éclairage là-dessus. Merci.
Merci beaucoup. Je propose de terminer ce tour de questions. Je donnerai la parole peut-être d'abord à Léna, puis à Monsieur le maire d'Almeida, Karen, et peut-être je laisserai aussi Patience réagir par rapport à la question entre relations des acteurs urbains et de l'État, parce que je pense que c'est un sujet aussi que vous avez abordé dans votre présentation.
Yes, thank you, Mansour. I'm actually very happy that you contradict me. I mean, I'm the first one who would advocate for, strengthening the accountability relationship between citizens and the state. And of course, as I said, maybe I didn't make this clear enough. It was a single case study, and of course, the reach of these case studies is limited. But still, I thought it was quite an interesting example. And what I meant to show with this is that decentralization, especially political decentralization, is not a system that is running in and of itself, so that it's always dependent on the conditions that surround this decentralization. So I think we always, or especially donors, also like to think in these accountability virtuous cycles. So, citizens will vote power holders out of office if they're not happy. And so local power holders become more responsive. But at the end of the day, if there are other logics at stake, such as patronage or, clientelism, and especially in contexts of lacking legitimacy maybe of actors and lacking resources, I think we also need to pay attention to the fact that this virtuous cycle can also become reversed in the sense that citizens lose trust in democratic institutions if they see that their elected leaders are actually not performing in the way they're supposed to. But yeah, I'm happy, and I hope that if you do it representatively, the study, if you would repeat it, I would of course hope that elected leaders do perform better. And maybe just the last comment, because it relates very nicely to what Jean-Fabien was asking about. What is the role of the citizens in all of this? And my research that I conducted earlier this year was on public participation. And I think this is an aspect that we haven't really touched upon. And of course, in this accountability dynamic, we would expect citizens to be able to give their input. And that, of course, also crucially depends on whether states actually do have frameworks that do implement them as to citizen participation. And I think there's a broad range, of course, of initiatives, and their status of implementation varies dramatically across the continent. And yeah, we can just hope that there will be more emphasis on including citizens, and we've talked about co-creation as well. So I think that is really a point that we need to take into consideration. Thanks.
Merci Léna. Je passe la parole à Monsieur d'Almeida pour répondre aux questions qui lui ont été adressées.
Oui, merci beaucoup. Je pense que la question dont j'ai hérité, c'est la question sécuritaire. Il faut avouer que la principale richesse du Bénin, c'est la sécurité qui caractérise le pays depuis des années, des dizaines d'années. Même si depuis environ 5 ans, il y a des soubresauts au nord du pays. Mais c'est limité, c'est circonscrit le long de la frontière nigérienne et burkinabé. Moi, je suis environ à plus de 400 km de ces endroits-là, pour l'instant, Boycon est une ville sûre, une ville sécurisée. Cependant, la loi béninoise fait du maire le premier responsable, le premier policier de sa commune, puisque c'est le maire qui est dépositaire de l'ordre public, de la salubrité, ainsi que de la tranquillité, ce que les francophones appellent la police administrative. Alors, à ce titre, nous sommes en train de prendre des dispositions. Nous avons demandé à l'État central la création de la police de Boycon, la police municipale de Boycon. Et la demande est déjà partie et nous pensons que d'ici 1 à 2 ans, Boycon, en outre de la police nationale, que nous appelons ici la police républicaine, nous aurons notre police communale, qui est communément appelée police municipale. Et de la même façon, nous sommes en train de promouvoir la coproduction de la sécurité. Autrement dit, la sécurité ne doit pas être seulement l'apanage, l'affaire des policiers, ce doit être l'apanage de tous les habitants. C'est pour cela qu'il y a des canaux de transmission de l'information désormais. Je vais vous donner l'exemple. Il y a l'année dernière ou en début d'année, et grâce aux renseignements tirés des populations, nous avons pu mettre la main sur des malfrats qui étaient une vingtaine. C'est des gens qui ne sortaient jamais. On donnait l'alerte et on a pu mettre la main sur ces gens-là. Aujourd'hui, après le maire, lorsque vous allez dans le découpage, je vous en ai dit que nous en avons 10 découpages de sous-communes. Et après, on a 66 quartiers. Les 66 quartiers sont pilotés par les chefs quartiers. Les chefs quartiers sont désormais intégrés au réseau d'information. Donc, nous les sensibilisons à la coproduction de la sécurité. Désormais, tout étranger qui vient au Bénin doit aller se déclarer au chef quartier pour qu'on sache qu'il est là. Et de la même façon, tout Béninois qui change de quartier, qui va dans un autre quartier, doit aller se déclarer. Donc, nous essayons maintenant de suivre les mouvements des populations pour éviter les infiltrations. Il faut dire que la menace dont nous avons tous peur, c'est la menace djihadiste. Et cette menace ne prospère que parce qu'il y a des groupes vulnérables dans lesquels les djihadistes vont recruter. Et nous avons ce genre de groupe sur notre territoire qui sont des gens de paix, qui sont des gens confondus à notre population, mais d'ores et déjà, par anticipation, nous les sensibilisons sur ce genre de choses. Et nous sommes aidés en cela par les autorités religieuses, les autorités, je dirais, locales, ce que nous appelons ici les têtes couronnées, qui nous aident également à sensibiliser, mais à titre préventif, les personnes susceptibles d'être enrôlées dans le djihadisme. Mais il faut dire que cela pose un autre problème, la question sociale, la question de l'emploi. Vous savez, les jeunes désœuvrés sont toujours la proie à des recrutements aisés par les djihadistes. C'est pour cela que nous avons mis en place tout un dispositif pour que nos jeunes puissent avoir accès à de l'emploi. Je n'ai pas le temps de donner les détails, mais je vous donne juste un exemple. Nous sommes en train de créer à Boycon une ferme communale. Et la ferme communale a vocation à recruter nos jeunes. C'est la commune, la ville de Boycon qui met à disposition les terres, qui met à disposition les moyens, qui met à disposition la logistique. Et nos jeunes viendront travailler sur ces terres gratuitement. Nous allons juste prélever une partie de leur production pour aller soutenir les écoles qui ont des cantines, pour que ces écoles-là n'aient pas acheté des vivres, mais que ce soit des vivres offerts par la ville de Boycon. Voilà quelques initiatives qui sont prises dans le sens de la sécurisation préventive de la commune pour que les touristes aient envie de venir à Boycon. Donc, je rappelle, pour ceux qui ne le savent pas, que quand on parle des Amazones au Bénin, quand on parle du royaume de Dahomey, on oublie souvent de dire que le royaume de Dahomey est né à partir de la ville de Boycon. Donc, la ville de Boycon est comme une rampe de lancement du royaume de Dahomey, mais également de notre royaume moins connu, mais tout aussi célèbre, le royaume de Savalou.
Merci, monsieur le maire. Merci beaucoup. Je donne la parole très rapidement d'abord à Karen, puis à Patience. Désolée de vous presser, mais
Yes, the room for the inhabitants. I think, first of all, it's very important to ask who are these inhabitants and what is civil society in this particular context, because the whole relationship between civil and political, between civic and military is so blurred. Like all these young people have at some point in their lives been also active in an armed group, and then they go back to civilian life and then re-enroll. So it's very difficult, like to some extent, to have, for instance, these youth movements that try to mobilize beyond, for instance, ethnic identity, but it's very limited. It's not like in bigger cities where you at least have some basic level of stability and livelihoods to be able to go beyond mere survival. And I think what you can see is, as long as the rationale of governance is still the nexus between authority, ethnicity, and land, you cannot expect people to break through that. Also not from civil society. So people want roads, they want electricity, they want security, and they want some form of income. And how can they get that? It's through patronage. It's the only way. It's just the only way. So the patronage, big man politics, that's the only thing they can rely on. So it just feeds into ethnic politics. It feeds into seeking protection with armed groups because the state is not there. So yeah, especially in these fragile places, I don't see many alternatives coming. But if you look at bigger cities like Goma, you have movements like La Lucha and so on that really try to have some kind of political alternative voice that is built on some different logics. Then the second, very briefly, on autonomy and so on. Yes, of course, the case of Minembwe is particular because of this Banyamulenge group, which has a history of contested Congoleseness. So the history is that their citizenship is contested. And so, yes, these narratives of that part of the Congo will be then governed by Banyamulenge really feeds into these grand narratives of balkanization, Rwanda wanting to take over. But it's very sensitive, and it's very particular to that case. But what you see is, of course, it's a border region. So even in larger cities, you have this thing of, border urbanism where people tend to orient across the border for livelihoods, for economies, and for alliances and so on. So yes, there is something, and we have also been writing on that, on this idea of trans-border autonomy, far away from Kinshasa. So yeah, it's recognizable, but Minembwe is too extreme as a case for that. Thank you.
Merci, Karen. Patience, do you want to give some final remarks on this panel?
Yes, I mean, there's the question about kind of the relationship between citizens and the state. I mean, it's a really interesting one because in the reconfiguration, at the same time, there's a push towards a call for rights, but also a call to be able to have some level of autonomy, to be able to appropriate a piece of land, build one's infrastructure and hijack a water pipe or a power line. And so you see a kind of active kind of citizen, active politics occurring around there, which is a way in which increasingly also it becomes a bit of a challenge for the state to say, well, and where there is even minimal infrastructure, such as in around mining towns in Zambia's Copperbelt, to say, oh, don't hijack that, and it kind of creates this kind of big maintenance cost because that is being hijacked. But then that tension between the state and citizens is tricky, because as the state retreats from its responsibilities towards citizens, citizens are asking, why should they be? Why should they adopt certain responsibilities in terms of and have particular obligations, such as paying taxes to the state. So it creates a paradox, which actually kind of also erodes the context for public governance and raising public resources because of that diminished relationship. And And there, actually, in our collection, there's kind of several cases that also show the kind of, that for wealthier residents who can kind of afford to go it alone, and one sees it in particular in the cases in our collection, the book DIY Urbanism, in terms of the emergence of private security in the absence of a kind of public police service, that potentially also kind of gets hijacked towards political ends, you know, where you see kind of, you know, neighborhood watchers becoming potentially some kind of militia, or being appropriated and attached to certain political actors, kind of raising also urban insecurity in particular locations where you have this very, very minimal infrastructure.
Merci beaucoup, Patience. Je vais devoir clôturer ce panel. On a dépassé le temps. Merci pour votre patience, également pour la patience de la part des participants en ligne. Je tiens une nouvelle fois à remercier l'ensemble des participants et participantes en ligne comme en présentiel, ainsi qu'à toutes les équipes de l'IFRI qui ont permis de réaliser cet événement. Je pense particulièrement à Alain Thiel, Anaïs Leleu et Lise Ossine du Centre Afrique subsaharienne, mais aussi toutes les personnes que l'on ne voit pas dans la régie et qui se sont occupées notamment de la mise en place de la visio. Merci beaucoup à toutes et tous et à très bientôt.